Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Salatu Salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Okay, inshallah, I'm going to begin. Bismillah. Okay, so this presentation is part two of my contribution to this course. And in part one, what I talked about was the experience of Shakhsiyya schools in the context of an alternative project which had decided to register as a school because that was assumed to be a good idea to do that, and the consequences of being within the state structure and the impact of that upon the project. So I went into a lot of depth about that, and I think that in itself is very much about reflecting on how far we can resist, as we were discussing this morning, how far it's possible to resist. And yet today what I want to do is just at least try and go through and I'm going to do an overview because there's so many different ideas and concepts that we're going to be covering that I can't possibly do it justice in an hour, but I'm going to try and do an overview of how certain ideas and concepts and theories or approaches or whatever you want to call it can play a part in trying to maintain being true to what it is you're trying to achieve. First of all, trying to help define what it is you're trying to achieve, not necessarily define as in like it's to reify it, not in that sense, but to as an organic kind of growth and process. So what I'm going to talk about is really conceptual evolution of concepts, if you like, that have developed on a theoretical basis. And if you do want to do that, then at the end we can probably talk about how those are concretely realised in terms of practical examples, but I don't think I've got time to do that. I want to just before sort of preface that with some of the concepts, some of the issues that have repeatedly occurred in today's sessions, and the first one being self-awareness, the second one being community, and the third one being leadership. I think that keeps coming back again and again, and as I was listening to it, I was thinking about how those three concepts tie in with a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. And the second thing I'd like you to think about is that one of the things that we kind of frames everything that we're doing, or is the foundation for everything that we're doing, is concepts of Iman, Islam and Ihsan. So I just want to read something out to you, sorry. And because I don't have internet on my laptop, I'm just trying to do bits from here and bits from there. But the idea or the principles of Shakhsiyya education, underpinning the principles if you like, is a conceptualization of Iman as, on the worldview of Iman, as recognizing Allah in every action, every word and every thought and feeling. Okay, so that's like something that's grounding a concept of Iman, which is then we're going to build these principles on. And on the practice of Islam, okay, practice of Islam as submission to the Sharia of Allah, which is a holistic way of life and not just a legal code. So you have the Iman, which is a worldview, a way of being, and then you have Islam, which is also a way of being more in a practical kind of way. And on the understanding of education as nurturing the fitrah, or empowering the fitrah to attain ihsan. So these are the kind of foundations, if you like, of conceptual understanding upon which we've then built some seven principles which I'm going to go through. So for in Shakhsiyya education, these foundational concepts of the deen have been related, so Iman, Islam, Ihsan have been related to Islamic concepts of education, namely Tarbiyah, Ta'aleem and Ta'deeb. So Iman,
just repeat them.
Tarbiyah,
Tarbiyah,
Ta'aleem and Ta'deeb. So we're tying that in. I can write that up for you if you like. Help. Okay. Ta'deeb. And please apologise for my pronunciation. It's really terrible of the Arabic, and I'm sure that many people will be correcting, covering their ears when they hear my pronunciation of these words. Okay, so Iman must be contextualized within the individual Muslim's reality to have an effective impact on his or her life. Iman is established by relating the Aqidah to all the complexities of an individual child's contextualized growth and development through tarbiyah. So when you're talking about tarbiyah, we're essentially talking about enabling the iman to develop in the child. But that cannot be done in a theoretical or in a sort of like in a non-practical kind of way. That doesn't happen. It has to happen in a contextual way. So when you're, for an iman to flower, that child's context, their life, their being in the world, to phrase Heidegger, that reality has got to be a very important part of that. And we've talked about that. We've talked about how we can talk as much as we like to people, to children, to learners, students. That, they're living within a context, and that context is constantly influencing them. Knowledge of Islam, of Islamic concepts, or knowledge and understanding of Islamic concepts, and ahkam sharia is acquired through ta'aleem, because ta'aleem is much more about learning, about ilm, about knowledge, okay? But ta'aleem inculcates Islam inward and outward submission, because amal, as it's stated, repeated in the Quran, cannot come without the iman. So, ta'aleem, knowledge of Islam, has to be outwardly manifested as well as in inner dimension. So when we're talking about ta'aleem, we're not discussing it simply as an acquisition of knowledge. And this takes us back to the issue of the fish. So it's not about being clever. It's about being wise. It's about embodying that and understanding it and having it intuitively. And the inner dimensions of an individual shakhsiyah, and I'm going to talk about the word shakhsiyah in a bit more depth, but essentially we've used the word shakhsiyah to mean an individual personality, an individual being. Okay, so we talk about it as character, but it's also very individual in that sense. Not that we're discounting the Jamaat, but each of us is on our own and we face Allah on our own. So an individual shakhsiyah is developed through ta'deeb in order to attain ihsan. So adab leads to ihsan. That ta'deeb is there to attain that. And obviously akhlaq is tied in with that. So these are the kind of foundational concepts that we're going to begin with. And then from these foundational concepts, we've derived sort of 7 principles. Now this process has not been something which is academic, okay? We didn't sit around tables trying to work out what is it, our principles, what are we doing. This is just basically organic discussion. And I talked about the history of shakhsiyah a bunch of months in the late 1990s up till now. Initially homeschooling our children, those of you who missed the first session. And just having discussion about what it is we think education should be, what it is we should be doing, and then just trying things out. And initially it was very loose, it was very fluid, and we had lots and lots of groups led by some of the ladies who are here today. And essentially then, over time, as you grow, you become more and more institutionalized, and we've become 2 schools. And there is a foundation actually which is overseeing the 2 schools and does other things as well, including teacher education and so on. But essentially, what happened over a period of time is that certain principles became things that we decided, okay, these need to be tied down, and we need to say that these are principles which shape everything we do. And so there's 7, and I'm going to discuss them all briefly, and I'm going to focus specifically on halakha, because I think that that's something that I can offer to those of you gathered here today. So to begin with, obviously we begin with the niyyah, the intention, and the principle of loving, learning for the sake of Allah, and growing towards Allah is the ultimate purpose of the human being. But what we mean by that is really about self-awareness, because one of the things we do with the children is at the beginning of the year we ask them, why are you here? Why are you in school? And it's amazing that the responses you get. Obviously the little ones have no idea. It's like, because my mummy bought me, and it's amazing. I've worked in a lot of schools, and you've probably got some kids still at the age of 15, because that's what you do. So what we were talking about this morning, about inframing, about knowing the world simply as it is, and never questioning, never having that attitude of wanting to know more, is a reality for many people. Okay, so for us as educators, the first thing we're doing is trying to address that both in the learner and the teacher. So the learner needs to be very self-aware, and self-aware of, I'm here, why am I here, what am I doing in this building or in this world, or what the purpose of all that is, and that ultimately what I'm supposed to be doing in this school is learning and developing to grow towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, that's something that, okay, we can tell them that at the beginning of the year, but there's a lot more that has to happen for them for individual children to grasp that and to understand that, and to some degree, because it's a primary school, their engagement with that may be fairly sort of basic or fairly rudimentary. But what we have seen is, as the children get older and they become able to reflect on that more and more, it can actually be quite deep how they relate to that. And then they begin to start relating that to all sorts of activities that they're doing, which are educational activities. And some of the kids have gone out to the primary and gone back to homeschooling or gone elsewhere, and we have these interactions with them where they reflect upon this niyyah and what it actually means. So it becomes a deeper thing as they grow. The second principle is shakhsiyah. Okay, why the word shakhsiyah? Initially the thought process was character. Purpose of education in Islam is character. Now, the Arabic word for character usually is akhlaq, but akhlaq doesn't translate very well into the English word character. Akhlaq is more about morality, more about your values, which is a very important part of character, but character is a bit more than that. Character is also about little quirks, about your sense of humour, your likes and dislikes, your disposition, how you interact with people, and that could be about values, but could also just be about you as a human being. And essentially, if in Islam education is a parental responsibility, and it's something that the parents are required to do, which is something that we say to all our parents, okay, this is your job, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed this duty upon you, and there is nothing on the Day of Judgment that's going to ask anybody in this school, other than their role in the school, about the outcome for your child. They just have to do their job. The outcome for your child, the education of your child, is your responsibility. And we say that, in one ear out the other, but we do say it, right? If that's what it's about, then what does a parent do? And I think for us as parents, homeschoolers, every child you've got is different, okay? What's going to work for one is not going to work for the other. If you're thinking about getting them to understand their niyyah, getting them to understand or become self-aware, be aware of their being, you can talk to one about it in that particular way. Your second child, it could be a twin. You need to still discuss it in a totally different kind of way. And to do that, you have to understand them. You have to understand that particular child, which takes a lot of time and effort. So one of the outcomes of the principle of shakhsiyah, and this parent-teacher-learner relationship, so this cycle that we have, is that we have to have what you could call a human-scale personalised education. So we started out actually limiting the number in the group to 5, and then eventually, due to demand, it sort of grew to 10. And then eventually, due to actually financial reasons, we made it 15 because it wasn't working, the costs were mounting and so on. We made it 15, and we have said that we're not going to go beyond that. So, but that 15, we've seen, just moving from 10 to 15, the impact on what we're doing. And we're able to achieve what we want to achieve much less with 15. So that, all these kinds of discussions happen regularly. And I think for one thing, what I want to share with you is that reflective process, that kind of iterative reflection of what we're doing, how it's impacting what we're doing, and what the outcomes of that are, and what's happening. And not in the kind of management bureaucracy way, but going back to what our principles are. That's an ongoing thing that we have to engage in. And that takes on, obviously, by qadwa, which is leading. So the concept of leadership, qadwa, is that teaching is being a leader. Essentially, whether you like it or you don't like it, if you're in front of a class, you're responsible for a class, you are a leader. And therefore, you have to think of yourself as a leader, and you have to understand what leadership in Islam is. And clearly there's that sense of being an example, being a role model. And that's something that requires a lot of heavy investment into what you can only describe as teacher education or teacher continuous professional development or so on. So the outcome of this principle is that we have a 1-year-long course, which Brother Ibrahim's been involved with, which we've run in Ibrahim College, as well as in our school. And our teachers are required within their first 3 years of teaching to attend that. But on top of that, we have halakha, sometimes weekly, sometimes fortnightly. We have other CPD sessions that, based around Islam. We have, 14 days of training annually. But it's an ongoing reflection upon what it is we're doing. And teachers, I mean, that's just, sort of the structures, but the essence is teachers interacting with Islamic concepts about what teaching is. And we had a discussion today about tagging Islamic onto something doesn't make it Islamic, right? We know that, of course it doesn't. But neither does talking about education just as education have an impact when you're dealing with the top subject we're talking about, which is essentially how as Muslims are we going to revitalise and understand our understanding of education and our understanding. Yes, we have lots to learn from the rest of the world, but essentially we are defining sort of fundamental concepts, Iman, Islam, Ihsan, we're trying to draw it out of that. So that discussion, that sort of how that works, or how is that impacting me, or does that mean for my class, or where's this verse of Quran that I've read, what does that mean for this? That ongoing process is qadwa, right? This is like, is that the day you stop being a learner, you need to hang your hat up as a teacher. So that concept that we've already discussed. Halakha I'm going to talk about a lot more. So it's obviously an oral pedagogy of circle time, so on, but I'm going to discuss that in a lot more depth. But Minhaj al-Darasiyya, the creative curriculum or holistic curriculum, we still haven't worked out an English version of that, or even the Arabic term doesn't really capture the concept. But the principle that education has to be real and to be meaningful, and it has to be real for the learners who are engaged in it. And essentially, therefore, the curriculum needs to be something that's negotiated between the learner and the teacher. So it's not a case of, here you come in and here's our curriculum and you need to absorb this and then you come out of it, which obviously these kinds of ideas is probably why we have lots of problems with Ofsted, because we're talking about this and they're talking about something else, and when they come in we have to totally change our terminology and say something entirely the opposite of what we're actually trying to do, which is, you've got this kind of schizophrenic personality going on and trying to run an Islamic educational system in this country. Not Islamic education, just educational, but educational with some purpose. So the curriculum, there's various aspects to doing that. One is that is thematic. So we go back to that old-fashioned 1960s lovely progressive stuff that you had in primary schools, where you have your topic and you get really excited about it and you go away and think about it. So the kids come in with some questions and they come in with like about their theme. They do a mind map at the beginning, so it goes on the board. They do post-it notes throughout the theme of asking questions, so somebody will post a question up, somebody else may answer it, or the individual child themselves may go back and answer that. But there's this development of their interaction with this theme throughout that 6 weeks, and their engagement with each other while they do it. And there's, in an ideal world, and I'm not saying this is how all our classrooms function, because we have change of teachers quite regularly and so on, but in an ideal world the teacher's drawing out each and every child's learning into community. Okay, so that community is engaging about a real life thing. So the themes are not necessarily Islamic, so we've got a theme like China, something like China, or circles and cycles, or relationships, which went down like a lead balloon with Ofsted, but because they were wondering where all the different types of relationships were. They thought we were going to suddenly start teaching them about lots of different types of sexual relationships, and no, that's not what this theme is about. That's not what we're trying to do here. This is just. But anyway, the idea being that it's a real life. It's something that has meaning. It's for that learner. It's not something that they're coming in, being subjected to, and going out. into the world. And also at a primary level, at least, you're not dividing things out into the subject areas. So when we have teachers who are doing this well, and you walk into the classroom, you can't necessarily tell whether it's an English lesson or a science lesson or something else lesson. And there are the experienced teachers that are able to sort of achieve that. They're just learning, and that learning is in many different forms. Balagha as well, I'm going to discuss in a little bit more depth of Quranic Arabic. I'll come back to that. But Taqdeer, the last principle about assessment, and this is where that challenge with the state and the expectations of the technological age, and the age of measurement, and the age of quantification, and the age of modernity or post-modernity, whatever you want to call it, that whole world that we are being in, is really conflicting with what we understand from an Islamic belief system education is. Because where in our belief or our understanding of education does measuring a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old against a national standard fit in? What has that got to do with anything? So yeah.
There isn't any national standard anymore, is it?
Oh yes, there is. What makes you think there isn't?
They've done away with levelling. So,
oh yeah, but they tightened it even further. So in theory,
yeah. So now it's about progress. So I guess what my point is that I think of all of those things that you've listed, assessment is probably the most in line with what the...
I think if you look at what actually, in fact, if anything, like, let me give you the example with Ofsted, is that up until I think our 2009 inspection, and we were established in 2002, we managed to get away with not having a tracking system for the children. Okay, because they could see the kids were learning, and at that stage, this is pre the Tory government. Okay, so they could come in and an inspector can see, yeah, these kids are learning. So we didn't have any tracking system whatsoever. They did say that as a recommendation. I had a long discussion, sort of back and forth with the inspector, and she said she wouldn't budge. She said, yes, you're a good school, we'll give you good, but you need to put in a tracking system. And after that, we kind of half-heartedly put in some sort of levelling and tracking system, but I think Fawzia's heart really wasn't in it, and she just didn't do it properly, because when they then came back in the London school in 2014, they just pulled it apart and said, you've got no understanding of what this is, and they asked lots of questions about the tracking. And
it has to be a prescriptive thing that they want to see, and unfortunately, if you fall either side of that, they will see that they won't value the education that you're giving the children. And this is a massive challenge for a school like ours, which is an alternative school, where we're looking at education in a very different perspective to how they're measuring it, and measuring is a key word here. And I think when you're talking about levels, unfortunately, those levels that they did have, they've got there's a lot of ambiguity about them, those levels. And there was, if you remember the jargon that was used within those levels, like almost and nearly, and right. It wasn't really hard and fast. Where you've got the Ijaza method from Islam, which is where we keep going back to, is that, is the child confidently able to do this? As a teacher, can I put my word on this as a Muslim that this child is able to do this? And this is what it's about at the end of the day for us, is that it's about that being able to say that confidently with amana that Allah's listening and watching. And it's not about ticking the boxes. So even when they did come, we were very, okay, we'll do this for you because you want us to do it.
So what we had which was our sort of approach of applying this principle, what we had as an alternative is learning journeys. Okay, so children, like scrapbooks effectively, right, but they record everything that they do. All right, and we have this from the age of 3 up until the age of 11. So some of these kids, they have literally, 10 when they finish. And we had 4 or 5 years, and we'd organised, your higher abilities and your middle abilities and your lower abilities. We used the jargon, and we did all of that, and we put them on the table, and they refused to even look at those as a form of tracking.
Why?
Well, this was a highly politicised inspection, if you remember from the last. Right, so that gave them an excuse, do you see? Yeah. So they used that. Had this been prior to sort of what's happening now, then they may well have looked at it. And that's why in 2009 we were okay to get away with it. And since they left, levels have gone, but we as Shakhsiya have sort of like swallowed a bitter pill, and we've brought in Target Tracker. Okay, and if you see Target Tracker for the new one, yes, they've got the levels, and you've seen the new one for the steps, even more prescriptive.
Very.
Can I add something? This has been going on in education for 30, 40, 50 years. And when I was studying action research in education in the 1990s, one of the leading guys in the field is this John Elliott, who was a professor of education at East Anglia. John Elliott, I put this on my Facebook because it was so extraordinary. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's quite difficult to actually grasp, but he's just this one sentence. He's talking about how education is the development of understanding. Development of understanding is construed as the extension of the student's natural powers in relation to the things which matter in life. So that's what we're talking about, right? Enabling the students to have responsibility, control, and ownership, and all of that. The manifestation of such qualities can be described and judged, but not standardised and measured. And there's a difference between being able to describe and judge, which is what you're doing with your learning journeys. You're describing, detailing, you're judging, but you can't standardise that and measure it. And the difference between the two is not necessarily very easy. It's gone now, you know. If it can't be standardised and measured, then it's not happening. But John Elliott, back in the 80s, writing this, you know, this is a big voice in teacher training. You know, that we're not about standardising and measuring, because that's not it. That doesn't mean you can't describe and judge.
Yeah, but I mean, the reason that we now we were re-inspected in right at the end of June, we've got requires improvement. Yeah, we moved up in the world. Is because of Target Tracker, simply and straightforward. The first thing they wanted to look at, they didn't want to even do any observations. This was really strange. Yes. Okay, they did not want to look at any teaching. They said it's the end of the. We know it's the end of the school year. You don't have any teaching going on. Well, we twigged what they were going to do. No, we've got every teaching going on, because we realised they were going to use that against us. So we made we dropped all our activities and said to the teachers, you're teaching till the last minute. While they're here, you're teaching. It doesn't matter. It's Ramadan. It doesn't matter that the kids that don't get to have their party. None of that matters. Okay? So they were like then didn't know what to do. So they went into some lessons, but they did not feedback on the lessons. They did not report on the lessons. There was none of that. Instead, all they wanted to do was look at the kids' books and look at Target Tracker. And the reason where you're not good is because not all your teachers are doing next steps marking in green pen.
Yeah, which is something.
You've got to have green pen.
Not giving that.
And we asked the children, and they did not all children.
Yeah, some of the teachers are still using red or blue pen. Okay, they haven't.
That's not allowed anymore.
No, not allowed anymore. Okay.
What?
Because we live in a free
It
society.
can't be. There's no well done. There's no right or wrong.
No.
It's your next steps for improvement.
And you can't check
And feedback is necessary as well.
Feedback is also
positive,
We had that
feedback.
great.
When the Bristol subspectrum started, you weren't allowed to be on
We
the
weren't.
list.
Yeah, no. They removed us from the list. Yeah. Absolutely. No, we are officially, technically, still were registered with Bridge, but they would not allow Bridge to inspect us, which is
So
bizarre.
you apply.
We applied and we were approved, but then I think it happened just before Go came into power.
Yes.
But then as soon as we were approved and everything, but since then we always had Ofsted. We didn't have Bridge. So I mean, I don't want to spend today going into the kind of nitty gritty of that kind of thing. But it was that silly. Not all your teachers are using green pen. Not all of it is effective as it could be, and therefore.
And it wasn't about the Shakhsiya, principles. It wasn't about philosophy of education. It wasn't about the quality of the tarbiyah that's going on in the school, the beautiful akhlaq and adab, the passion with which the children love to learn. None of that. It was all about these prescriptive things that they'd been told they've got to look for, and it just threw everything to the dogs. Really, everything else was it's irrelevant for us. And almost we're used to have where they used to come into schools and it was about your mission statement. What do you believe in? What do you stand for? It wasn't about that anymore. And I don't think it ever will be.
I don't think so. Okay, so this issue of taqdeer of I think that's expressed it really well, that we just don't believe that measuring is anything to do with children's development. Maybe at the age of 16, 14, whatever, right? You could present a case for that, and I'm not going to say that I'm that narrow-minded that I won't, think that there's any kind of place for it. But what's it got to do with primary education? And what's it got to, if we don't believe it's got anything to do with it, why must it be imposed upon us? So that's the issue of that. So right. So I want to now move on to halakha. So what is halakha? And I'm sure you all know what halakha is probably better than I do, but I just thought I'd read out something for us to think about. That halakha is a spiritual circle time instituted by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his tarbiyah, his education of the early Muslims. It is conducted purely orally, with students and teachers sitting in a circle on the floor. An integral part of traditional Islamic education, halakha continues to be core practice across Muslim cultures. Halakha is credited with the transformation of personalities, i.e. the Sahaba, empowerment of individuals and of communities through a social justice agenda, and the development of Islamic intellectual heritage, including the sciences, arts, and mysticism. The format varies immensely and can be transmission-based, teacher-led, or dialogic, student-led. It can also be a collaborative group effort. The curriculum or content is open, but the paradigm is an Islamic worldview, and the frame of reference is the Islamic revealed texts, i.e. the Quran and Sunnah, the sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's like a sort of short summary of what you could define as halakha. Now, what is halakha in Shakhsiyah schools? And essentially, one of the first things we did as homeschooling mums was start doing halakha with the kids, which is not that different to sitting your children down and doing story time or having a little chat with them or so on. And if you do it in a group, it's quite refreshing. So it was very informal, very relaxed. But what we began to see is that, and then I think there was a process where we reflected upon this ourselves, and we remembered that actually, our parents, although we kind of like in our naivety didn't consider them not necessarily to be so practicing, as Muslims, more cultural Pakistani type Muslims or Arab type Muslims and so on, culturally, our parents used to do this, and they used to do it, just here and there, there was no curriculum, there's no set thing, it doesn't have to be on a Saturday morning or anything like that, but this is something that they did. Eventually we began to do this on a daily basis, starting the day with it. And by 2005, so this had been going on since sort of 98, we decided that it probably was wise to have a curriculum. By that we just mean a list of topics and concepts that had to be discussed in halakha over the course of the academic year. So there would be we had mixed age groups at that stage, so they weren't done by age, it wasn't like a school, but from this particular group, sort of red class or yellow class, they'd cover these topics or these concepts, and all the teachers, the only restriction was that by the end of the academic year you have to have covered everything on this list. The reason for that was that we found that some teachers just spent the whole term talking about Tawheed, or the whole term talking about, I don't know, the heart or whatever, and there wasn't enough sort of breadth or depth. So there is a curriculum, and that is in the process of being reviewed and revised for many reasons. And the curriculum itself began to tie in with some of the concepts. So we're talking about Tarbiyah, Ta'lim, Ta'deeb, Iman, Islam, Ihsan, and I'm going to discuss that in some depth. But essentially, what is the point of doing halakha with these kids? And that comes back down to us defining the school, naming the school Shakhsiyah. Because what we understand is that as a parent, what is it you want for your child? You want your child to find their way through life. Okay, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for them to equip them with essentially the character, the moral qualities, the outlook, their own personal sort of personality to deal with the things that life is going to throw at them, or to find their journey through life, or to that's what it's about. And to do that, any learner has to have a certain level of self-awareness. that can't happen unless it's coming from the learner. That this is what I'm here for. What is my being? What am I to do with my time, with my body, with my, this kind of idea. And that's something that Halakha gives them the opportunity, at least, to potentially do that. They may choose not to. They may not quite understand it. But they've got a sit-down space where they're allowed to talk every morning for at least, 20 minutes with the very young kids and up to 45 minutes. And there is the flexibility within that if somebody wants to raise something, they can just say, look, I want to talk about this. And they're able to do that. This, by the way, also had, you can imagine what Ofsted thought of this, but I'm not going to go into that. Right.
We all want to talk about the gym.
Yes, they do.
We're supposed
they
to
do.
charge you.
We do.
We're not allowed to think about it.
But the idea is that they need the opportunity to explore their own faith. So we don't have Islamic studies in our school. There's no lesson called Islamic studies. It just doesn't. You just don't have that. You have halakha every day. And interestingly enough, the talim aspect of it, it's, the kids have that. They have the knowledge. I think somebody said earlier on that you could learn what you need to know about Islam in a couple of weeks as an adult. I mean, it may take children longer, but in terms of the knowledge aspect of it, but the concept aspect of it, which I'll discuss a bit later, that has to be engaged with to be internalized. And ultimately, you have to accept. And sometimes it's hard when we're training our teachers and having this discussion with them. It's hard for people to understand this because of the inframing that we're in. But you have to accept that every human being's got to come to their own belief about life. There's nothing that any of us can do that is going to ensure that anybody else in this room is going to die on the deen. Nothing that any of us can do. And we can't do that with our own kids. We can't do that ourselves. And that's something that, again, is like, it's probably more about what happened in early Islam, that recognition, as opposed to a sort of a reified Islam, or a fossilized Islam, or a declined Islam, or the kind of things that we're facing in the late early 21st century now. There is also in that, to attain the ihsan, the need to develop, and this is something that's very consciously thought about in our halakha program, the relationship of that individual child with Allah. And it's odd because kids have this. They talk to Allah, and they will ask Allah for things, and they're quite happy to do that. They may then have a very strange idea of what that means, and they will come to you with all sorts of things. But it's giving them that space early in life that they know that that's something that they can turn to when they need to. A relationship with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so the love of the Prophet, which you cannot explain outside of Islam. I find this very difficult to explain. But you recognize it as a Muslim. You know that why back in the 80s when Salman Rushdie wrote his book, the kids, the teenage boys streamed out of the nightclubs of Bradford and got on the street and started yelling. We know that. We know this love of the Prophet that is just, it's just, I suppose, his presence is being felt more than a month's journey. It's being felt for 1400 years now, and that is something that we generate through just reflecting upon that ourselves, but giving the space for that, not just in halakha but in the school as a whole. That's a very important part of what we need to be doing. And then the love for the Quran, which again I'm going to discuss, and there is a slide on the Quran and Quranic Arabic. The capacity or the ability to be able to reflect upon yourself and your nafs and your own shakhsiyah is again not something that is easy to teach. But the idea is that halakha gives the space to do that. Okay? Right, so there's 4 sort of elements to the curriculum, halakha curriculum, and the first one is actually just called hifz, and essentially this is about what the children learn through memory so that they embody the Quran. It also includes a few ahadith every year, not many, a few dua every year, and we also have vocabulary, which is a conceptual understanding that they need to have certain Islamic terminologies, because I'll explain why we consider that really important. But essentially, a love and appreciation of the Quran is very fundamental, and for children to love the recitation of it, love the feel of, kids do like to the older kids bring their own Quran into assembly every day, and so when they're reciting they like to open it up and so on. We encourage that. Having a Quran-centered curriculum in the sense that whatever you're discussing, what does the Quran say about it? Okay, not in a set kind of way, but referring back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And if you're, as a teacher, in the lesson plan, we create the frame for them. You have to have lesson plans anyway, but we would stick in that frame, where's the Quranic ayat that you want to sort of reflect on or try and bring into the... So there's a Hifz program, which is, fairly advanced. They do Juz Amma by the age of sort of 9, and then they do a few of the longer surat after that. We use Juz Amma also as a way to build a Quranic outlook on life. So this is actually done through assembly as opposed to halakha, where the surat, the meaning behind the surat is discussed. So for example, when you talk about Surah Nas, and you talk about seeking refuge in Allah, and you talk about what kinds of things. So with young kids, you could talk about what scares you, and what do you do when you feel scared, and then that kind of monsters in the dark or stuff comes up, and how can you deal with things which are scary? How can you have the courage to deal with that? And then talking about the seeking refuge in Allah and drawing on that as courage, that kind of thing, but giving them an outlook that builds an understanding about not what life must be about, but how to approach being alive, being a Muslim. Okay. So there's the Hifz of Dua, and then once they
Can I
grasp...
just ask a question about the Hifz? Are you doing it when they're reciting individually, or are they reciting as a group together?
I'm going to ask Nadia to answer that.
We do recite together, but then they recite it individually too. So we have 10 to 15 minutes every day in the morning, just like in the beginning of the lesson, just to memorize the Quran. And mashallah, in our school, the children learn the whole Juz Amma. When they finish year 6, they memorizing the whole Juz Amma, Surat Al-Mulk, Surat Al-Waqi'ah, and Surat Yasin, and sometimes they exceed to Surat Al-Kahf or Surat Al-Dukhan, is depending on their ability. And once we end up even with a whole juz of Surat Al-Baqarah. Then we just concentrating on them one by one to recite with them, and reciting as a group, and then reciting with one by one.
They do group recitation
Yes.
with a strong voice.
Yes. Together, and
Because I just that was like a pillar of how we educated the children. The first thing that they did when they came in the morning was to sit together and recite together and learn by repetition together. So they weren't learning by reading; they were learning by listening, and then they were kind of enunciating, and actually the kind of activity of reciting together is a kind of extraordinary bonding.
So we do that daily morning assembly.
Yeah.
So morning assembly is a recitation and then discussion of surat in Juz Amma, because they tend to recite Juz Amma because it's a revision as well.
Yeah.
So then you talk about the surah that they're reciting. So that lasts 15 minutes. And then they tend to go off and have halakha, and then at some point during the day they're going to have Arabic. And when they have Arabic, there's 15 minutes of focused memorization of a particular surah.
So that's kind of individual and separate and kind of people at their own kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that sort of group recitation has a real I know a lot of people.
Because I tried one year when they finished the whole Juz Amma, we read Surah Yasin, we tried just up to your ability, so one by one. And in the end, the children were begging, can we please go back to group recitation? Because it is stuck in the mind more, because it's just and we enjoy it. I don't want to learn it by myself. And then we went back to just group recitation.
Okay, so then the point being that is Quranic terms, such as, for example, Iman, Islam, Ihsan, what the idea is that through the halakha and the Arabic and the assembly, they understand that conceptually, and then they understand how those terms relate to each other. So, for example, we all know the relationship in Iman, Islam, Ihsan, and you know, growing towards Allah. So they begin to they would learn that hadith, and they would have to try and gain an understanding of that. And it you know, it's at a child level. Nobody's saying that they're coming with some wisdom of a 60-year-old man about it, but it's giving that basis, setting a basis. So the second strand of the halakha curriculum is around tarbiyah. And remember we said that we linked back to Iman. And this is going back to the fitrah, because tarbiyah, as we know, is to nurture the fitrah until it achieves its full potential. So it's about nurture, it's about growth, it's about development. But one thing we do is that at the beginning of every academic year, the first halakha is who am I? And kids start off by, you know, and initially when they're quite young, it's just, oh, you know, my favourite colour is, and tell me about yourself, and I've got this number of brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. But, you know, as they get older and they're doing this on an annual basis, it's really interesting, because then they record it and put it in their learning journeys. So if you look at a learning journey of a child who's been there for sort of 5-6 years, and you look at what they've done for who am I, you get this sense of self beginning to develop over a period of time. And we encourage our teachers to go and read those learning journeys and read who this child says that they are. And it's not that they can't talk about this during the rest of the year, but we at least start the year with this. So this sense of identity is really important. And then this sense of personal character, they have this, you know, kids do. They know that I'm the jokey kid, right? Or I'm this kid, or this. And how they relate to each other. And that's something that is very important, to give them that opportunity to think about their personality. And, you know, we get them to think about things like their likes and dislikes. So, you know, if a child's talking about cars, okay, and coming in and not constantly talking about, okay, why? Why are you talking about cars? What actually excites you about this? And, you know, it doesn't always work. We've had classes of, you know, where they still talk about the cars, and it's that peer pressure, and you can see the social influence, and it's like, you know, so-and-so's dad's got a BMW, and so-and-so's dad's got this or whatever, and this car's faster than. But we at least try and tackle that. What's that got to do with you? Does that really mean something to you or not? Occasionally the penny drops. Occasionally, sometimes, you know, there's like some questioning there. They may come back to that.
Yeah, you know, when you're doing the halakha, how much is it peer-to-peer, and how much is it...
Depends on the teacher and the class.
I'm just thinking about the cars aspect of it. That I've always found that maybe for the older ones, definitely, you know, when they're talking with each other, as you know, that's where...
But they may not be talking about the cars in halakha, by the way. This is something the teacher might have picked up on in the playground. Usually that's where you get the information from, right? What's happening in the playground or elsewhere. So the teacher may then bring that into the halakha and discuss it. Okay, so you say that this is what you're saying about yourself, your likes and your dislikes. Why? What actually appeals to you there? Is this something that you like for yourself, or are you being socialised into this by cousins or whoever or whatever? But in terms of how much they talk to each other, the ideal is that they're supposed to, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but we know that the average in classrooms across the UK and across America as well, by the way, is 80% teacher talk.
And I mean, it's getting more and more, isn't it? You know, I mean, they say they don't want pupils to talk. Sorry, they say they want pupils to talk, but the opposite is happening.
Yeah, the opposite's happening.
What about, I mean, you know, in sort of some of the sort of third world countries where, I mean, I can remember teaching in Pakistan, in the Punjab, and we had there were so many children there, about 200, 300 kids, and only one teacher. So what they did was they had some children teaching others. I mean, of course, you know, there's all sorts of issues and problems, but some of it was working really, really well. Yeah. You know, because for example, you know, a child listens to another child, and I mean, you can't always have it all the time, but it's quite interesting. I mean, have you experimented with any of that?
No, we haven't. We try and keep it small, so we have 15 kids, and teachers trying to get them all to engage. Doesn't necessarily mean they all have to talk, but they all have to engage. Traditionally, Halakat, so where you had, like, for example, at the time the classical scholars, Abu Hanifa and so on, they used to have, the circles would be like concentric circles, and the more advanced students would sit in the centre, and it was the case that you'd have literally sometimes hundreds of students, but these are adults, and it was the case that often the students were answering the questions of the newer sort of students. So that's something that is in the tradition of that, and that's where I think places like Pakistan they carried
I've tried it 2 or 3 times. Sometimes it didn't work. It worked really well in one place that I tried it, but in another place, what happened was the child got a bit above himself. You know, I mean, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I chose the wrong child. So it's quite interesting.
I mean, we do have some times where children lead a halakha, I mean, I'm going to talk a bit more about participation, but so there's a personal character, but then there's like me in context. Okay, so we have this section in our halakha curriculum, which is really interesting to Ofsted, called Muslims in Britain. So one of the things we do with our teachers is say, okay, that whole way of teaching Islam that you may be familiar with, what does that have to do with the kids growing up in this society? So what we expect to happen in halakha is, if an Islamic concept is introduced, you ask the kids to reflect upon what that means for their life. Okay, so if for example you're talking about sabr, say, fairly easy concept, you ask the kids, so what does that have to do with you? And then you can start off by saying people say very simple things like, oh, I have to have sabr with my little sister because my mum's always telling me to, or I have to have sabr and I can only have chocolate on Fridays, and so on. But as they get older, you do begin to get deeper discussions happening where children will talk about something difficult they went through in their life, and they will understand sabr to mean more about constancy than just patience. And they begin to get a deeper understanding of what that concept is. So as they grow, and it's discussed again and again, you begin to see the fruits of that. And in fact, actually, we've seen the children, quite young children, being faced with quite traumatic things on occasion. We've been going for some time now. The kids have seen things, or had to experience things, or deal with things. And the sabr is there, it comes out. The fortitude is there, and that you realise that, initially it might just be about, I had sabr with my little sister yesterday, but the form of engagement that they're having with Islam is there's hopefully something to it.
I think you build that resilience, isn't it? That it's like that they feel the real life experiences, and they actually can see them for what they are, because they understand and engaging with them. They look at things and think, I have to have sabr now because this is a time that's needed, and you feel you can have that engagement with them.
Not only that, when teacher having a situation, the children remind the teacher about this. Just like the teacher, remember that you have to have the sabr. Remember, you can't preach them.
I think that's such an important point, Nadia, because I think when the children actually feel empowered, that they can, we'll talk about enjoying the good with the munkar, but when young children feel that this is the right and proper thing to do, and I'm happy to stand up and do that, even though I'm going to stand up from the crowd. I think that's a very valuable trait.
And you stand up in front of a big, huge teacher like me. It's just like they are small and tiny, and then it's just like a reminder. That's really, it's just like, and one of the things that one of the last Ofsted is just like you said that you give the children this eloquency of speech, and they are just like they are very able to express themselves, mainly because of the halakha, because they sit in there and they just like they feel free to express themselves and talk, and they don't have this pressure of what we faced before. It's just like, no, don't say this, it's just like, you're not allowed to say this, no, they have the stand to talk, and which is really important.
Even sitting is a tarbiyah, isn't it? Sorry, sister.
Sorry, I was just wondering, how how much is it, for want of a better word, censored? Like, so if there was a kid who came in and said, yeah, my cousin, she's got a boyfriend, or is there like a language or a space that they're allowed within, and then do you, like, because that might curtail what you do, somebody else might see you to
I think that with those kinds of issues, there's probably some self-censorship that goes on. And I don't necessarily see that as a negative thing, because what the kids grasp is, for example, we discussed the concept of haya, what it is to have haya, okay, which I think is not there in many Islamic studies curriculum. And what the kids grasp is that it's not necessarily the case that they can't talk about something like that, but that it's not probably the wisest thing to raise that in a public forum where, and I've had kids say that to me, is that, that they'll come to you one-to-one and they'll say something like, well, you know, there may be other children in our group who've never heard of this, because you do have that. And this is one thing that we had this issue with. So for example, over this issue of Ofsted in September 2014 required for us to teach children about gay relationships. The discussion we had with them is that we're happy to do that with the kids who know about this, but we don't understand where there's, if you do have a couple of children, it's about a third in each class, I'd say, whose families have ensured that they're not aware of this, they're not aware of any kind of sexual relationship, okay? So it's not just about, they have still managed to maintain some sort of childhood innocence. Why should that be shattered at this age, you know, the age of 6 or 7 or whatever? Because other kids know about it, or because you're requiring it, or because, you know, it's not that they should never hear about this. It's about, you know, me in context. I live here, right? This is something happening in the society around me. I need to understand it. But it's about an age appropriateness. So we had this discussion with them, and you know. So the thing with that is that there is self-censorship, and it's not that it's a free-for-all and that, you know, I'm going to confess my sins or anything like that. It's not that. But they also learn how to have dialogue, okay? And they will, it is interesting because kids will bring in issues that they probably wouldn't discuss, maybe not things to do with sexuality or so on, but other things. So kids may well say, oh, you know, I used to do this, or so on.
I mean, my worry as a teacher would be that actually, if that is maybe conveyed a little bit too strictly, that the being that they're showing me is not quite themselves.
There is that. And so that needs to then be tackled. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in Tadib, about the nafs, is that way you're presenting yourself in school. And in fact, I know that's happening. And that's not good. And in fact, if anything, as we've grown, and it's now no longer a few parents who are very consciously involved, there's a, you know, one of the reasons we started out is that we didn't want children to be hearing one thing in school and one thing at home. But now we've gone to the other thing, so they're hearing the Islam in school, or the questioning in school, or this kind of approach in school, and at home they're getting social media and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we're seeing that. And that is, we're not going to pretend it's not there, but if you've got any answers, then that'd be great. How do you tackle that? Islam in context. So, you know, we talk about Islam in terms of their local community and so on. We don't shy away from world affairs. We don't throw it in their face. So, for example, Charlie Hebdo happened. We don't come in and start talking about an assembly because it's still a primary age school. But if a child raises it, then you open the discussion up, and then you get that engagement going. Try and stay away from that whole narrative of what, you know, violence in Islam and so on, because they're still young. But what we do is give them a deeper sort of understanding of what Islam is in the world. So, for example, we haven't yet introduced Goethe into our curriculum because I think that they're a bit young for that. But we do Muslim Spain, and we do it, you know, in the sense that we talk to them about European Islam and the interaction between the Muslims and the Europeans, and in fact how Islamic concepts of accounting the ruler and so on were not existent in Europe, but they existed in Muslim Spain. So the British values thing, you know, when they said, well, where are you doing the rule of law. We said, well, here we're doing it in Muslim Spain, and this is where we're giving them this idea and this concept. So there is what is being put into the curriculum, and there has been a bit of research needed to do this, is an understanding of not what it is to be European Muslim in the sense of the Tariq Ramadan book, but the fact that these kids were born here, okay, so they don't know anything else. So they have to understand that they are essentially European, they are essentially, you know, British or from Londoners or whatever, and not be scared of that and see that as part of their identity. But also, I mean, for example, in our Tottenham school, we've got at least a third of the kids have
Mixed parenting.
yeah, mixed parenting. So they're English, they're also, I don't know, say Algerian and Spanish. And they're also Muslim, and they're also this. There's got lots of hybrid identities, so that's something that's explored and discussed. And how Islam impacts the world, and then me and the world, so giving them that sense of awareness that there is a big wide world. And I find this really difficult sometimes with teachers, because they don't realise that that's what learning is about, you know. So you do this in the training, that learning is actually about discovering the world around you. And what you know, so all those aspects of that. And then me and the Akhirah, realising that the world isn't all there is, so the metaphysical side of things. Won't dwell too much on that. There is another aspect of this section of Tarbiyah, which is to do with critical pedagogy. So critical pedagogy is a movement that is there from social justice movement. So you have it came essentially through the Marxist sort of critical theory type thing, but it's the point being that education is generating an awareness that challenges power. So you have Freirean notions of this. You've got critical race theory in the US, and you know, Brother Ibrahim and I have done a paper on this. But halakha, if you look at what the Prophet ﷺ did, halakha was a core force in a social movement. And again, getting teachers to grasp this is quite challenging. But essentially, part of Islamic education is a social movement. There is a political element to it, in the sense that we recognise that we are social and political beings, and that we have a responsibility. We have to have an understanding of our interaction with the wider world, with the society. So that's an element of that as well. Obviously, you know, it's a young age, and there's a certain amount of that you can do with them. And you know, for example, I wouldn't do civil rights movement with kids this age. I'd probably leave it till about 14 or 13 or so on. But that's part of the thinking behind the program. Global history and personal history. So we tie in history taught through halakha. So halakha covers Islamic studies, RE, PSHE, citizenship and history. And one of the things that we had to do to satisfy Ofsted is draw out the differences between them, because they didn't like the fact that they couldn't identify where these things were. So, you know, we then had to sort of say, okay, here's the PSHE bit, and anyway, but that's another story. But the global history, personal history, so when we do history, is that, like I said, we kind of get them to understand that Muslim Spain is our history. And for example, one thing that we do British Empire, which again went down like a lead balloon with Ofsted. We do that in year 6. They do a thing called British Empire. It's centred around India, so they learn about the Mughals, and they learn about East India Company, and they learn about all that kind of thing. We don't really go into, like, you know, the I can't remember what Barg it was, but that we don't mention the massacre or anything like that. You don't need to. Kids can see for themselves. You don't need to go into the gory aspects of it. That's not what we cover. But what we do with them, for example, is we ask them to go and interview a grandparent. And so every child in the class goes and interviews a grandparent, asking them how they came to Britain. And then they come and tell their stories of kids who, you know, whose grandparents have come from the West Indies, who have come obviously a lot from India, and then from other parts of the British Empire. And they begin to get an understanding through this way of how their personal history is related to the global history of Britain being a colonial power, Britain then needing labour to come here, and the fact that, you know, especially in Slough, a lot of their grandparents came to fill the factories, and that's why they're here, and that's why they're now living here, so that they then get an understanding of who they are. That then, yes, they're immigrants, but they're also part of this global changes that happen. So this is the Tarbiyya aspect. The Taaleem aspect, which we're linking to knowledge of Islam, is about conceptual knowledge and understanding. So this is obviously not rote learning. And I mean, my PhD is on this, and I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but there is the I suppose some meta theory behind this in terms of the relationship between language and cognitive development, at least akal, if you understand it from the Western sense. So Vygotsky is very influential educational, well, he's a psychologist essentially, but very influential in educational psychology, defines that learning happens through, an easy way of understanding is interthinking. Interthinking happens through conversation dialogue. So for Vygotskian theory, learning doesn't happen on an individual basis. It has to happen where you're having some interaction with the other or a text. And essentially, part of education is that you scaffold children so that they eventually begin to have interthinking internally, so the dialogue can move to the internal level. But most cognitive development happens through dialogue. And this is really interesting because obviously with Halakha, yes, it has, there are many formats where it's very transmission based and you've got teacher talking to the learners. But what I'm interested in is if you go back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and you look at the curriculum that he would have covered in Halakha is the Quran, okay? And particularly in the Meccan period, which I suppose there's some parallels with what the situation we're in today, that there was no Islamic polity, there was no Islamic systems or setup or whatever. The Quranic surat at that time are very much about questioning. And it may not be, I looked through it and it may not be that there's certain, you've got verses with question marks at the end, but the content, if you define it as questioning as the will to know, the will to understand, that's what it is. And there's a dialogue where, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks these questions, or, have you not thought about this? Have you not, have you not seen the people who give the lie to the deen? Or, those kinds of basic surat that we look at. There's a dialogic element there. And I'm really interested in this. I haven't done that much as I need to do on it, but I certainly think that's something worth looking into. So what we're doing in Halakha, does actually involve dialogue. And the way the PhD is going is I did 3 Halakha with year 6s, so 10 to 11 year olds. And then I did 3 with 16 to 18 year olds who'd been through our program and had either been homeschooled or gone to whatever, but they're now sort of older. And I asked them sort of 3 sets of questions. I asked them about freedom, what they think autonomy is, what do they think it means to be an autonomous individual, so about that kind of self-awareness, which is really interesting. And then I asked them about what it means to be a Muslim. Then I kind of tied that in and said, okay, if to be a Muslim is one who submits, then how do you square that with freedom? And that was really interesting. And then I asked them about Halakha and about Islamic studies, because some of them had been to other formats of Islamic learning, and I asked them for their experiences and asked them to reflect about that. And then I got them to question whether they felt, because they all talked about the dialogic element of Halakha. They did that. I didn't say to them, do you find Halakha as dialogic? But they did talk about it. And both sets. Obviously the older kids were much more articulate and able to discuss it in much more depth. But then the final thing was that, okay, so do you think that there's a relationship between Halakha and having this self-awareness and this self-autonomy, and autonomy not in the sense that I'm free to do what I want, but like understanding that I'm accountable for what I make of my life, I'm accountable for my being. And that was really interesting. So I'm now in the process of analysing this data, to use research terminology, and hopefully we'll see what comes out of that. But I think that's very, very, the relationship between language and personal development, I mean, it's broader than cognitive development, okay? There's an affective dimension to it, there's a cold, there's a heart. We understand akal in a very different kind of way. I can't really do that in the PhD. I don't, you have to kind of focus in on something. But even in our, there's, what I'm looking at is that there is the Ghazalian tradition, and there's he's been defined as a neo-Ghazalian scholar, Naqib al-Atas, in Malaysia, who was instrumental in the Makkah conferences and the Islamization of knowledge movement, which I know has its problems and so on. But his sort of foundational paper, The Concept of Education in Islam, he took, I pulled out sections of that and sections from Vygotsky, and there's parallels. Because he talks about man being a rational animal, the nutq, and then he talks about the rationality being tied in with the root word for speech. And he talks about, there's so many different elements. There's also obviously the two kind of narratives of beginning that we have in the Quran. So you have the beginning of creation and Adam alayhi salam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches Adam the names of things. And I've kind of drawn from that, taking from this Ghazalian Adas tradition of the names of things is sort of a conceptual understanding. And I know we had discussion about this before in phenomenology and so on, but I think there's something in there about conceptual understanding of language as having meaning, which then gives you a way of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's revelation to us. And there's also the signs of aspects, but then also the beginning of Islam, begins with Surah Alaq, isn't it? And Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So again, recite or say. And there's an area that deserves some exploration, and a theory needs to be developed from this. And Adas talks about this to some degree, but I'm trying to tie that in with what we're doing in Halakha, because I can see this. And there's other sort of educational terms like reflective talk, exploratory talk, and so on that I've looked at, because Vygotsky influence on what they call sociocultural theory on education is huge in this country. And there's a lot of work going on in classroom talk and a lot of research, and there's very few examples of actual dialogic teaching. So even with Halakha, you have to establish first of all whether the dialogue is actually happening or you just imagine it's happening. There's a lot to cover with this. But essentially, in terms of the theory aspect of it, the way I kind of understand it is that you've got this development of the akal, but the akal being part of the qalb aspect. But that comes through gaining an understanding of names, concepts. And that understanding isn't like, okay, now I've got it. It's an ongoing learning process. But the relationships between these concepts is what gives you as a being a way of negotiating yourself and the world around you and your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's where I am sort of with that theory, and I need to kind of develop that a little bit further. So the idea that Ta'aleem is building a conceptual worldview, which is very different to having knowledge, very different to being clever. And the final one, I've been going on for a long time, so Ta'deeb and developing the nafs, so understanding the self. And this is a much sort of like, I suppose, a bit more neglected. I mean, area in our curriculum. We do have this there, and some teachers who I think have their own self-development very much in hand do this very well. But this is a sort of higher order of the halakha which needs further development. And this is about understanding the human being, having understanding as teachers concepts such as fitra, such as qalb, such as nafs, such as ruh, which is in itself, you haven't. There is some work done by, I believe, the Book Foundation on an Islamic spiritual psychology or something like that. But the concept of what the human being is, or how the psyche works, or the human being works. That's something that we cover that with the teachers and so on. But essentially, going back to Quranic concepts again, what is the qalb, what is the nafs, what's the ruh? And not to say you're going to get a 2-line definition, but to reflect and to contemplate and to think about these things. And that then having that relationship with yourself and Allah. So the who am I and the kinds of things you've got in tarbiyah, taking that to the next sort of level of spirituality, tying that in with the ibadah and the muamalat, but then also about feelings and emotions. I think this is really important, is that kind of sort of PSHE education of knowing yourself and being honest with yourself. The point you raised about, are my actions my own? Or am I doing it for others? Or am I doing it for Allah? Or am I doing it for myself? Who am I doing it for? What's my intention here? You know, all that kind of thing. We do have these kinds of discussions with the children. Different children respond in different kinds of ways. Also depends on how far the teacher is able to articulate that or to draw that out of the kids. And there is a sense of adab and akhlaq, and you know, there is with adab being literature, and Atas talks about, because Naqib al-Atas, his whole sort of thesis is that education in Islam is not tarbiyah and it's not ta'lim, it's ta'deeb. And he says ta'deeb incorporates tarbiyah and ta'lim. That's his argument. And he says that we misunderstood Islam. That's the whole thing. The problem is that none of us understand what Islam is in the first place. Okay, so we need to sort of re-understand what Islamic terminologies are, and he takes it from a quite traditional view, because he's reviving the Ghazalian sort of tradition and understanding of it. But Ta'deeb he talks about as literature, as refinement, but ultimately he also defines it as adab, as understanding the proper place of things in relation to each other. So that's again coming back down to understanding what being is in relation to everything else that is ontologically there, which isn't necessary, and doing that from an Islamic worldview. So doing that from the Quranic understanding. So he talks about the signs in the ayat in the Quran, and obviously the ayat in the makhluk, the creation. So tying the akhlaq, where akhlaq and adab, the civilizing effect of that we heard about, that's something that needs to be understood. So this is also an element of halakha where these kinds of discussions are encouraged. And again, it's not something that you could measure to see what.
Do you use the word nafs or the concept of nafs in a negative fashion or in a positive fashion, or a combination of both?
Yeah, a combination of both really, because obviously you have nafs al-lawwama and the nafs al-amara bil-su and so on. So it's at the teacher level, and even the kids understand that you've got this nafs thing that is maybe making you feel greedy, or making you feel in this kind of way, and that those kinds of emotions need to be sort of reined in. And they may understand that as your mind controlling your heart and so on, but that might be a sort of you could argue a superficial understanding or whatever, but they do begin to start talking about it, and I think it's giving them the vocabulary to talk about it, giving them the capacity to talk about it. That's more important. I think
contemplating where does that take us, and those sort of questions that sometimes we tend not to ask children because they're children. We think, they won't be able to engage with that, but they do, because their fitra is quite, it's still pure, isn't it, by Allah? So they find that when you do ask a question like that, they will honestly engage with whatever feeling they might have had, which they might say to you, honestly, I think I was a bit jealous actually that I didn't get picked to go to sports day or whatever it might be. And then, you discuss, okay, then where did that jealousy stem from? And you take it to another point where you get to the point where the child's actually feeling like, I've got to a point where I can sort of be at one with it, if you like, or even realise that, okay, that's something that I'd like to change about myself. And that's reflective practice in action, isn't it? When you take them to that pinnacle or that point. Not to say, needless to say, it's not going to happen again. I think we're not building robots, but it's that really getting the children to engage with their nafs and pinpoint it and see and identify and say, actually the realisation is that maybe that is something that I don't particularly want to have in my character. So I'm actually going to struggle with myself and that whole juhud of the nafs, and get them to put the certain qualities of good Islamic tarbiyah into their character for themselves.
Do you start to carry about year 5 or year 6? I mean, sometimes when I'm I still sort of work with kids. I just sometimes like to leave certain concepts. I like to skirt around them. Let the children decipher what nafs is. What
I mean,
I don't think you're going to be able to explain it to them too much anyway, whatever you do. It's not a concept that is easy to explain. You can try, and you probably would try and give them some understanding, but it's you know, like it's not an easy one. I think for us, like I said, it's giving the opportunity, right? It's giving the language, the vocabulary, the just the idea that that's something that you could do with your, or that's something you should do, or that's something that is a lifelong pursuit, and getting them to understand that. Whether they choose to apply that for themselves or not is down to them, but not leaving that until they're 21, because it's too late by then, isn't it? I mean, I don't know.
You have to have elements of taming the nafs, isn't it? Because that's Allah Ta'ala says that there needs to be that within the insan. Is that you? Otherwise, we will let ourselves free reign over everything. So I think that there's a purpose to actually nurturing that identification of what the nafs is, and realization that it's part of the self, because they need to, like you said, when you get to 20, to be able to have that refinement of, you know, being able to hold themselves back or having the self-control for something. And these
there
are
is
quite important things.
discussion about it actually in the halakha, because I'm starting to do this analysis stuff now. This the halakha I did with the older kids. When you talk about freedom, there's a point where one of the boys brings up the issue of the nafs, and then there's some discussion about the nafs in relation to freedom. So by this stage, they've got some understanding of it, and they're beginning to start talking about it. But they're young adults now, so you'd expect that.
Well, 11.
No, these are the 16 to 18-year-olds. Yeah. So I know that. I mean, just recently, last week, I was looking at that there's he raises it in relation to freedom. So they're talking about being free, and then he says, yes, but then, you know, if you have freedom, then what about your nafs? If they start talking about, do you really? Because they're all saying that, of course, you should be free to begin with, and then they start discussing that in a lot more depth. Okay, so but what does freedom mean? Does it mean that you let your nafs run riot? Is that what it means? And the discussion then ensues about it.
I assume that with many of the sort of details you're raising, these are things that are embodied by the teachers and brought up when they come up. Yeah. Such classes are not necessarily built into the curriculum. You know, it's not going to be a maths and then the nafs.
Well, they have halakha, and so every day. So it's not like maths and now it's nafs class. But what it's like is that in the morning, say you've got, like for example, something to do with Muslim Spain, right? And you're talking about leadership. Say, you may begin if you're talking about say Tariq bin Ziyad, and you're comparing him to say Abdurrahman III or so on, because they've learnt about that in history, okay, in halakha, which is history, and then then you may have this discussion with them. Well, okay, at what point as a leader would your nafs maybe interfere with that? You might bring in something like that as a teacher, but I'm talking about the theory. Alhamdulillah, we've got some very good teachers, but we're also like all other Muslim schools. We've got a revolving door of teachers coming in and out, and it takes a good 2 to 3 years for teachers to understand
this particular thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do this in 1 hour.
The only time with some of the sciences you're detailing here, as adults, the only time I've ever heard them being raised is in durses after dhikrs, when we've got states that we can actually absorb these things, and when the state of the person leading the dhikr is able to convey them in the right way. I just find it quite intriguing that, with the child's understanding of the world, how a child views these things. And there's something that somebody said to me, is that the nafs of the child is excusable.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to, whatever the diseases of the heart are when you're a child, in some ways they're not held to account for certain things when they're teenagers. So I sort of, the way I'm taking this is a way of a child recognising these things prior to entering into teenage years.
They're really clever. My daughter told me, so, just they know that they're not accountable. They're really
they'll say to you, but I'm not accountable after this many years old. They're very sharp like that.
The only person who's accountable is you.
Yeah, and they'll tell you that. And I think there never could be more in the lines. And we're very frank and open. We say, yes, it's true, you're not accountable, but wouldn't it be, isn't it a ni'mah that we know how to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that when you do get to that accountability, then you understand what it is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holistically, you know, and want to do, and how your nafs in itself has that beauty of submission. And I think through that they do recognise it, but not just, needless to say, we're not putting on them that there's not this fire and brimstone approach where we're making them feel guilty for how they are, but rather just engaging with that, you know.
Yeah, and I mean that is, that's not to say that sometimes you have to take a teacher aside and say, look, no, that's not what you're trying to do here.
Yeah.
There's, you're not here to say to the child that they're wrong, or
and
make them feel
that was innately wrong, something awful that they.
Well, I think it's great that you're dealing with it. I think it's really wonderful that you are actually, doing something out there with these very important concepts, because it does shape the Islamic personality later.
I mean, the purpose of it is in terms of a way forward. We don't believe that we're going to say, okay, here's a model. That's the way forward. That's not what the point of this is. But what we're trying to say is that, okay, this is our journey. This is some of the principles we've come up with. We do think there's something to halakha. We're keeping on researching that and developing the curriculum, developing the way that teachers do that, and all this kind of thing. And it's going to take a few more years, quite a few time to get it to where we want it to be even now. And I think that it's something that, we're talking about the periphery. Hopefully, maybe this may well, because to me, the Prophet ﷺ, this is what he did. And I don't know, I wasn't there in the Arqam to know how he did it, but what I can look at is the Quran, and I can look at the Sahaba, and I can look at the Hadith, and I can look at what was going on at that time. And there's definitely, a social justice movement, there's definitely self-awareness, there's definitely all the things that we're talking about.
I mean, sometimes, like, for example, as a parent to a child, when you're talking to, let's say, for example, when I'm talking to my son, and it's something that's happened, then that's a real moment in time. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. I don't have 14 other individuals in the room. And so, we know each other a little bit more. I know what I've said before, and I've got the trajectory of what I might say later. So, have we, by creating a school, created this strange sort of a simulation of a sub-reality, of another sub-reality of a dream? I mean, is that where the problem is? I mean, is it that the parents have just thrown all their children to us, and you deal with them? I mean, are we doing something? Is it like an Islamic bank sort of thing? Is it a Trojan horse? I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it?
We're quite good at calling parents in and saying, hello, this is your responsibility, this is your problem. We're seeing this kind of thing with your child, worries us, it's not worrying you. We do that like that, really.
Yeah.
Because we try and maintain that relationship. But to be honest with you, I think the past 2 years, it's the whole Ofsted thing has thrown us off track of that. I don't know.
What I mean is that I think I've explained it really badly. What I mean is that
no, I know what you mean. This is the best answer I can give because I don't think that. I think to some degree you're right.
Yeah, and parents. The thing is that you often, I think that one of the things at SLT we have when we speak is that we do feel that not all our parents understand the deepness of what we're trying to do with their children. No, they don't, and that will impact their children. In the context of sort of you're running this lopsided sort of project, if you like, in the sense that you're building this rich experience in school engagement and dialogue and tarbiyah, and then you've got sort of almost like a little bit of a void at home, as it were. But I think it's what it is, and we're in this community, and what we do is hold on to the fact that this is for now it's been a journey for us to try and nurture this this real sense of love for Allah and His Deen and Islam, and getting the children to engage with that. But we can't solve all the problems of the community, and it might well be what you're saying, that parents just sort of putting the children on us, most likely,
I mean, as a bird's eye view, when we look at it from afar, maybe that's where the problem is. Maybe we've created an institution, and parents are bought into that. Maybe, I'm at fault, we're all at fault somehow, into perpetuating the system. Maybe we need to look at it again from a bird's eye. Say, well, look,
I think
I think maybe the thing that would put it into context is something I think you said to me, that you were trying to create a community through the school, rather than the school being a reflection of the community. So the present situation that you are in is to really the success of the school doing that. It's not about the children. The children establish the direct relationship with each other. What is the relationship between the parents and the school and between themselves, and how much is there a kind of a shared thing? I'm sure
it has changed over time.
It's not the same as it was.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think the strength of what we had when we first started is very different to where we're at now.
But you do get pockets of it still.
Yeah. No,
I have to say there's pockets of it, but then we're much bigger now than when we started out. When we started out, we had, 20 kids.
And
now
you
it's
had
100.
only like-minded people who came to us. The people had thought about it deeply, so they put the children in.
And I think, I said this in the first session, why did we register as a school? Why didn't we just stay doing what we were doing? All of this is virtually, you're constantly struggling against the system to try and do this. And
I think sometimes, you should look back, and I think you're doing the right thing to say, should we do that or shouldn't we do that? I mean, I've been in that situation where, you're working right past midnight and you're doing all of these, you're creating all these systems and you're doing that, and I just decided to stop. I said, right, that's it. I'm sort of leaving, and then you do begin to see different ways of being, and also as Muslims, I don't think it's so much as how are we influenced by Europe, but also how can we create a new Europe as well, and if we can offer some alternatives that are not tinkering around with systemic creations that are already there. And you are the perfect people to do that, because you're right there at the chalk face, or the projector face, as would I call it.
One of the things that I think we have, I'm really happy at the way that is panning out, is when I go to a lot of conferences where you have sociocultural theorists, so educators who are talking about dialogic teaching, okay, and they are fascinated by this. They really, and for example, like when I, just this week I was, it was quite a senior academic, was looking at my transcript and was, this data is so rich, it's amazing that you've got these, and this is the older kids, the teenagers, they were really amazed at the because in transcripts of classroom talk, they get happy if a child has a 5-word utterance, right? Because when you actually, it's bad enough when you're watching a classroom, you're observing it, but once you get it onto a transcript, you begin to see how children don't say anything at all. And I've looked at lessons which are considered to be dialogic, and it's still not, but I mean, I haven't analysed my transcripts yet, but this is like just an anecdotal comment that you had an academic at Cambridge saying, wow, this looks like really good. You need to segment it. You need to break up the utterances, basically what the amount of speech that there is. You've got to do this a lot more, because this is a very long, convoluted sort of contribution. And Ofsted are very amazed as well at how much the children do talk. So, I mean, just in that, like you're saying, I feel it's really important to get this out there and say, look, here's an Islamic school, and here's something that's happening there that you're struggling to get happening in your own classes.
And how many other schools have you been to who want to put this into practice?
Well, the dialogic teaching movement, there are a range of, you've got the Cambridge Primary Review, and you've got the Wroxham Transformative Alliance, and we've joined these kinds of organisations, that you've got lots of schools that are trying to do this.
But not Muslim schools?
No.
You haven't been to, had no Muslim schools?
We have had quite a few Muslim schools want to do our halakha, but what was it that people were saying to you?
Yeah, the thing that the current feedback that I sort of got is that often what it is that they purchase halakha curriculum once they started their school, but then what it is that because they then haven't got into looking at how we train and what we do, and the Islamic teacher education course that we have, and actually looking at understanding the theory and themselves as practitioners, as teachers relating to it, they then think, you know what, that's something for Shakhsiyya school. They're doing it over there. They're doing it really well, but we don't really understand it. And that's just it. And that seems to be what's going on.
We haven't got the time to
we haven't got time to even think about what it is you're talking about, and you're just
they haven't. They haven't got the time to do that. And that's a bit of a problem. But
I think that happened with Ibrahim Academy, isn't it? We had a whole year's session with the teachers, and it was all really, really interesting. But hold on a second, I've got to get them through this GCSE science, okay? I'd love to do this.
I read a case study of a school back in the 90s when I was an English teacher, and the school management decided to have an oracy week across the whole board, across every subject, every teacher. They had to do as much speaking and listening as possible, and as little reading and writing as possible, which completely turns most people's practice upside down, especially in secondary schools. And there was a huge amount of resistance from the staff at first, because it was just all too new. It's like teaching and talking and listening is wasting time when you could be reading and writing. And so there's been a lot of resistance to this for
the comprehensive that I work at. I mean, this year they did bring in biologic teaching as one of the big things that they wanted to kind of really inculcate. I mean, as a movement within the school, it's still very much lip service. You could probably get to like 10 years later and it's still just lip service, and then it'll go to the next thing.
We started to have a bit of the opposite problem in Sheffield and Bradford. Bradford started doing talk partners, but I think it was because they did it in a different way. I think they started with a deficit theory, whereas obviously you have high aspirations and expectations, and they did it in terms of trying to get the language better. And what was happening was that in year 6 the children just were bad biters, maybe talking too much, but then of course they didn't have everything else that you have in place, to create all the little bits of that. So it's interesting how different theories are used by different organisations.
I don't know if I should touch upon that last thing about how, with regards to like brother was saying, how maybe looking back and thinking about the why of why we started what we do, and I just think that it may be a small organic project, but we've got those children that we work with and those families truly that we work with, and they do leave us with, there is a mashallah, a tarbiyah that we inculcate through the school by them living it and being with us and going through our pedagogy and practices. And I think that even though that there's a juhud and there's a lot of hardship with it, there's never a day that I think I sit down and think I regret that Shakhsiyya has done what it's done and the lives that we've changed. And I think we truly have changed. And obviously it's research to come maybe in 10 years' time, when we can go to those adults and ask them about what was their primary education experience, and how did it actually manifest as something really into something positive or say beneficial into their adult lives. But I think that Shakhsiyya, maybe it's not we're not saying that it's not about mass education, mass tarbiyah, but it's a project which you can see that through the human, it's about human scale, isn't it? Through that interaction with those children and giving them the time and the space to speak, and giving them, that platform to be able to say, these are my inner thoughts, this is my understanding, this is my confusion. And I think that is the solution to raising our Muslim children in this country today, because if you're not doing that, then I feel that children will, like the sister said, start to sort of self-police and just say, oh well, adults don't need to know this. I don't need to address that right now. It's not acceptable right now. I'll just put that undercover, if you like, and that will be, I think, in the long term, will be damaging to the Muslim community and our children and even the identity as Muslims.
Can I ask? Sorry, I know that we're probably running out of time, but
we can go on as long as we like.
Okay, this is
I'm locking the doors.
A fundamental question, which is especially when we come up with an approach to pedagogy, let's call it, teaching. The first something we come to something that we're satisfied with, that we think, well, this is what it is, this is what it ought to be. I mean, to what extent do you question yourselves? How confident do you feel yourselves that you have been the product yourselves of that kind of thing which you think is good for others? In other words, are you qualified by your own standards as human beings in terms of your own upbringing, your own education, to be enough of an embodiment of these key matters of transmission and being exemplary in some way? I mean, and being able to engage, this is the word I keep hearing. I mean, do you have these crisis occasionally? I mean, in terms of what we should really be doing this. I mean, are we up to this?
Every other month.
Oh yes. Are we up to it? Is it how do you if you like you said, you haven't been through something yourself, but then I mean I think for my master's project we had a discussion amongst staff as to why they were here, right? Why they were doing what they were doing in the school. And what was really interesting, that what came out of it, there's two things which came out. I mean, a lot came out, but two things which are relevant to what you're saying. One was that a lot of them had really bad school experience, okay, particularly in primary school, and did not want to put their children through that. So that was one thing that came out. And the other thing that came out was that a lot of them were talking about how actually their parents had tried to do some type of halakha type discussions with them, and the value that they placed on that, and the fact that we were now doing that much more sort of regularly than our parents had. And one thing that came up, which is really interesting, is that we began to realise that in fact parents who'd come from abroad, like I said earlier today, is that they didn't realise, like you can see that, okay, you don't have madrasas here, or you don't have masjids here, we need to set up masjids and Quran classes and so on like that. You can see that. But parents couldn't see, like for example, there was one teacher who said that, she remembers an incident where her mum said to her, okay, and now you need to pray your sunnah. And she said, what sunnah? And this is like a 5-year-old girl. And the mum said, sunnah? And she's like, no, I don't know what's sunnah. And the mother did not know how to explain it. And it's not because the mother was incompetent or ignorant or whatever. It's because when you grow up in a society where that's normal, why do you need to explain terms which are just, children just pick up by osmosis because you're in the society? You don't need to do any of this. Like murua. Like I didn't know what that was until today. Right, so, I knew fatuwa, but I'd never heard of murua. So that's what I'm saying, is that, what we're trying to do, part of our thinking process, I keep coming back to terminology and vocabulary and language and so on, is that if you lose those terminologies and that language, you lose your understanding of the deen. So,
perhaps isn't it the other way around? Is it if one has the deen, then one can never lose it in that way, or it's not lost by way of the language. It's lost by
mean intergenerationally.
Right.
That's what I mean. I mean in terms of as a generation, if we're not like our parents tried to pass understandings to us, but because they were, or sometimes they assumed that we would know something. Like I remember having a conversation with my mother at the age of 14 when she said, Karbala. And I said, what's Karbala? And she said, what do you mean you don't know what Karbala is?
That's what I say every day for my children. It's just like, what do you mean you don't know that? It's like, I'm sorry, Mama. You didn't
tell me.
But because it's just like I brought up in my country, it's something
how would you
naturally.
So this is the kind of thing I think that there is, and we still have first generation Muslims coming in.
And can I add something? Just like first generation, like me, you trust the school. That's what you do. It's just like you trust the teachers. So you give your child for the school to teach them and bring them up, to help you to bring them up. And you do your part. But then I came to this country and I met Farah, okay, that's not what's happening in the school. That's not the same. So it is really just like school play a very important role in bringing up your children. And because it's not the same schooling, you don't have the same upbringing for your children, and you do need all these things, whether from the school, or home, or the community, to help up bringing up proper Muslims who understand their deen, and they have they are proud of their Muslim personality. They are just like they will stand everywhere. They say, I'm Muslim, and that's me. You like me, okay? Just like as long as I'm doing the right thing. And otherwise, it's just like they're going to lose their identity, and this is the worst thing you're going to do.
Hang on.
Should we finish there?
Yes.
And I'm sure we can carry on tomorrow.
Yeah.